My aunt threw boiling water at my dad when he asked her for help and said he deserved it for being a beggar. Now, she's the one begging. When I was 15, I got diagnosed with a bone tumor in my leg that needed immediate surgery. The operation would cost $30,000 after insurance, and we had 2 weeks to come up with it, or I'd risk losing my leg. My dad worked construction, and my mom cleaned offices at night. They'd saved $8,000 over 10 years for emergencies. Dad swallowed his pride and went to his older sister Linda for help. She owned 4 rental properties and had just bought a vacation house in Florida. Dad hadn't asked his family for anything in 20 years, not even when Mom had complications during my birth. Linda was having tea with her book club when Dad showed up. He explained about my tumor, showed her the medical papers, told her we'd pay back every cent with interest. Linda stood up, walked to the kitchen, and came back with a pot of hot water she'd been boiling for more tea. She threw it right at my dad's feet, splashing his legs. She said that's what he deserved for showing up at her house like a beggar, embarrassing her in front of her friends. She told him maybe if he'd made better career choices, he wouldn't need to grovel for money. Her book club sat there watching my dad's pants soak through with boiling water, while Linda lectured him about financial responsibility. Dad left with burns on his ankles. He never told me what happened, but Mom did years later. They borrowed from loan sharks to pay for my surgery. Dad worked 3 jobs for 5 years paying it back. Linda never asked if I was okay. She showed up at my high school graduation, though, made a big speech about how proud she was of her family's accomplishments. She actually took credit for my recovery, telling people she'd been there for us during tough times. She asked why Dad was limping, and he said old construction injury. She laughed and said, "That's what happens when you choose manual labor." For 10 years, Linda kept getting richer. She'd brag at every family event about her properties, her investments, her vacation homes. She'd give Dad unsolicited advice about bootstrapping and working harder. She'd point at me and tell everyone how well I turned out despite my parents' financial struggles, like poverty was a choice they'd made. She never knew Dad still had nerve damage in his feet from the burns. I became a physical therapist, which Linda called a waste of my potential. She said I should have gone into business or real estate like her. She'd introduce me as her niece who settled for healthcare work. She'd tell people at least I was employed, which was more than she expected given my background. When I was 28, Linda's husband, Robert, got diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. It was aggressive and needed experimental treatment not covered by insurance. The cost was $200,000 up front. Linda had the money, but it was all tied up in properties she couldn't sell fast enough. She needed liquid cash in 3 weeks, or Robert would miss the treatment window. She called Dad first, said it was different because this was life or death, not like some routine surgery. Dad reminded her that my tumor could have killed me too. She said that was different because I was young and would have recovered either way. Dad said he didn't have money and hung up. Linda called me next, crying about how Robert was dying and she needed family support. I asked her what she meant by support. She said just a small loan of $50,000 until she could sell one of her rentals. I told her I remembered what happened when Dad asked for help, and the answer was no. She said she didn't remember that. Must be confusing her with someone else. I asked if she remembered throwing hot water at Dad. She went quiet, then said that was a misunderstanding and a completely different situation. Linda spent the next 2 weeks calling every relative, begging for money. She'd sold herself as the rich, successful one for so long that nobody believed she needed help. Her book club friends said they couldn't mix friendship with money. Her tenants said they'd love to help, but times were tough. Her financial advisor said liquidating would take at least 6 weeks. She showed up at our house at midnight, banging on the door. She got on her knees on our porch, literally on her knees, begging Dad to help save Robert. Dad stood frozen on our porch, staring down at Linda on her knees. His face looked completely blank, like he was seeing a ghost. I watched from the doorway as Linda sobbed about Robert dying and begged Dad to save him. Her expensive clothes were getting dirty on our concrete porch. The silk blouse she wore probably cost more than our monthly grocery bill. Mom appeared behind me and gasped when she saw Linda actually kneeling there at midnight. I realized this moment had been 15 years coming. Dad's construction boots were inches from Linda's manicured hands. She was grabbing at the porch railing, trying to steady herself while she cried. The porch light made her diamond rings sparkle even through her tears. Our neighbor's dog started barking at all the noise. I could see curtains moving in the house across the street. Dad finally spoke and told Linda to get up because he wasn't helping her. His voice came out completely flat and emotionless, like he was reading a phone book. Linda started crying harder and grabbed at Dad's pant leg. She said she would do anything and pay any interest rate he wanted. Her fingers clutched the denim fabric and wouldn't let go. I felt this weird mix of satisfaction seeing her beg and discomfort, watching another human being fall apart like this. She deserved this after what she did to Dad. But watching someone actually break down on their knees felt wrong somehow. Linda's makeup was running down her face in black streaks. She kept saying Robert's name over and over. Mom moved past me and touched Dad's shoulder. She said we needed to take this inside because neighbors were starting to turn on porch lights. I could see 3 houses with lights on now. Linda was making so much noise that people probably thought someone was getting murdered. Mom invited Linda inside and I wanted to argue, but knew Mom was right. We couldn't have this scene playing out on our front lawn. Linda stumbled getting up from her knees. She had to use the porch railing to pull herself standing. Her legs were shaking, so bad she could barely walk. Mom guided her through our front door and into the living room. Linda sat on our old couch, still crying while Mom went to make tea. I noticed Linda looking around our small house like she was never really seeing how we lived. Her eyes moved over our worn furniture and the water stain on the ceiling. We had the same couch since I was 10 years old. The fabric was faded, and one cushion had a patch where the cat scratched it years ago. Linda's house had leather furniture and marble counters. She was seeing what $30,000 in medical debt plus loan shark interest looked like. Dad refused to sit down and just stood there with his arms crossed. He positioned himself between Linda and the front door. I stayed in the doorway watching this surreal scene unfold. The clock on the wall said it was 12:30 in the morning. Mom came back with 3 mugs of tea on a tray. She set them on the coffee table and sat in the armchair. Linda wrapped her hands around the hot mug but didn't drink. She just stared into the tea like she could find answers there. Linda tried to explain that Robert only had 3 weeks before the treatment window closed. She said she had already called everyone she knew. Her voice kept breaking between words. She listed all the people who said no and all the properties she was trying to sell but couldn't liquidate fast enough. The banks wouldn't give her a bridge loan. Her financial advisor said 6 weeks minimum. Her book club friends all made excuses. Even her own tenants claimed they had no savings. I watched Dad's face stay completely hard while she talked. His jaw was clenched, so tight I could see the muscle jumping. I remembered him limping through my childhood because of what she did to him. I remembered watching him ice his feet after long construction shifts because the nerve damage made them hurt worse. Linda was talking about losing her vacation house and how unfair the banking system was. Dad finally told Linda exactly why he wouldn't help. He described the boiling water and the burns and the 5 years of loan shark payments. His voice stayed flat, but his hands were shaking. He told her about working 3 jobs and sleeping 4 hours a night. He told her about the loan sharks showing up at our house when payments were late. He rolled up his pant leg and showed her the scars on his ankles. The skin there was still red and shiny even after 15 years. Linda's face went white, and she started saying she didn't remember it that way. She said it was just a splash, and Dad was making it sound worse than it was. She actually used the word exaggerating. I felt my anger spike hearing her try to minimize what she did. I spoke up for the first time, telling her I had seen Dad's scars my whole life. I told her I remembered Dad crying in the bathroom when he thought no one could hear. I told her Mom had to wrap his feet in bandages every night for months. Linda's mouth opened, but nothing came out. She looked at me like she forgot I was even there. Linda turned to me with this desperate look and said I was a healthcare worker, so I understood how serious Robert's condition was. She actually tried to use my career to guilt me into convincing Dad to help her. She said I knew what pancreatic cancer meant and how fast it kills. I told her she called my job a waste of potential at my own graduation. I reminded her she said I settled for healthcare work. Her face showed she genuinely didn't remember saying that. I was never important enough for her to track her insults. She probably said mean things to people every day and forgot about them 5 minutes later. Mom quietly asked Linda to leave because it was after midnight and this wasn't accomplishing anything. Linda begged for just 1 more minute. She pulled out her phone to show us pictures of Robert in the hospital looking terrible. He was hooked up to machines and his skin looked gray. His eyes were sunken and he looked so much older than the last time I saw him at a family party. I saw Dad's expression flicker for just a second when he saw Robert's condition. His jaw unclenched slightly and his shoulders dropped. I realized he wasn't as unmoved as he was pretending to be. Dad looked away from the phone and told Linda to go. Mom stood up and walked Linda to the door. Linda kept saying please over and over, but Mom just opened the door and waited. Linda finally left, and I watched her walk to her car in the dark. After Linda finally left, the three of us sat in the living room not talking for a long time. The clock ticked on the wall. Mom sipped her tea. Dad stared at the spot on the couch where Linda had been sitting. The house felt heavy with everything that just happened. Mom eventually said that Robert never did anything to us, and he was dying, which made this complicated. Dad said Linda didn't care if I died when I was 15, so why should he care if Robert dies now? But his voice cracked a little when he said it. I could hear the doubt creeping in. I went to bed, but couldn't sleep that night thinking about Robert dying because Linda couldn't get money fast enough. Linda absolutely deserved this karma. But I kept picturing Robert in those hospital photos looking scared and sick. He was just some guy who married the wrong person. The revenge I thought would feel good just felt hollow and complicated now that it was actually happening. I stared at my ceiling and tried to convince myself this wasn't our problem. Linda made her choices 15 years ago, but Robert's face kept appearing in my mind. The next morning, Linda called me directly, which surprised me since she had never called me in my life. I didn't even know she had my number. Her voice was calmer now without the crying. She asked if we could meet for coffee to talk without Dad there. I agreed partly out of curiosity and partly because I needed to understand if she actually got what she did or if she was just desperate. I met Linda at the coffee shop on 3rd Street 2 days later. She picked a corner table away from other customers and already had her hands wrapped around a mug when I walked in. She looked tired in a way I had never seen before, like she had been crying for hours. I sat down across from her without ordering anything because I did not plan to stay long. Linda started talking immediately about how sorry she was for what happened all those years ago. She said she felt terrible about hurting my father, and she wished she could take it back. But then she added that it was a really stressful time in her life, and she was not thinking clearly. She said if she actually hurt Dad, she was truly sorry, because that was never her intention. I stopped her right there and asked if she actually remembered throwing the boiling water or if she was just apologizing now because she needed money. Linda looked down at her coffee and her face went red. She admitted she remembered being really angry that day because Dad embarrassed her in front of her book club. She said she remembered picking up the pot and throwing it, but she honestly did not think it was that serious at the time. She thought Dad was exaggerating about the burns because he left right away and never said anything about it again. I felt this cold anger spread through my chest, hearing her minimize what she did even now when she was supposedly apologizing. She had convinced herself over 15 years that scalding my father was not a big deal because facing the truth would mean admitting she was cruel. I asked Linda about her rental properties and her actual financial situation because I needed to understand if she was really as stuck as she claimed. She explained that all her money was tied up in real estate and she could not get traditional loans because she was already leveraged on most of the properties. I pushed harder, asking why she could not get a home equity line of credit or a personal loan with all those assets as collateral. Linda got defensive immediately and said her financial advisor told her those options would take too long to process. She said the banks were being difficult and she had already tried everything possible. Something about the way she said it made me suspicious because Linda always had an answer for everything, and now she was being vague. I left the coffee shop feeling like she was not telling me the whole truth about her options. Over the next few days, I started quietly asking around about Linda's reputation as a landlord. I called a few property management companies and asked general questions about the rental market in her area. One of the property managers mentioned that Linda's buildings had high turnover and tenant complaints. I managed to track down contact information for one of her current tenants through public property records. Her name was Roberta Lewis, and she rented a 2-bedroom house that Linda owned on Maple Avenue. I called Roberta and explained that I was Linda's niece looking into some family business. Roberta laughed bitterly when I said Linda's name. She told me Linda was the worst landlord she ever had in 20 years of renting. Roberta described how the water heater broke last winter and Linda refused to fix it for 3 weeks in January. She said Linda raised the rent 15% last year, even though the house needed major repairs. Roberta mentioned that Linda threatened to evict her over parking a second car in the driveway, which was not even in the lease. She said Linda would show up unannounced to inspect the property and complain about minor things like dust on the baseboards. Roberta asked if I was thinking about renting from Linda and told me to run in the opposite direction. I thanked her and hung up, feeling sick to my stomach. Linda's cruelty was not just about family or some isolated incident with Dad. This was who she was as a person in every part of her life. She treated everyone beneath her with the same contempt she showed my father. 2 days after I talked to Roberta, my phone started ringing constantly with calls from relatives I barely knew. First, it was my cousin Michelle, who I had not spoken to since I was 12. She called saying she heard about Robert's situation and asking if our family could help. Michelle said something about family obligation and how we all need to support each other in hard times. Then my Aunt Karen called with almost the exact same speech about letting go of past grudges. She said Robert was innocent in all this and did not deserve to die because of some old argument between Dad and Linda. I got 3 more calls that day from cousins and distant relatives, all saying basically the same things. They talked about forgiveness and moving forward and how families should stick together. Every single person said Robert was dying, and that should matter more than whatever happened in the past. I realized Linda was working through the whole family network to pressure us. She was calling everyone and telling them her version of the story, where Dad was being unreasonable and holding a grudge over nothing. None of them knew the truth about the boiling water or the loan sharks, or Dad working 3 jobs for 5 years. Linda had painted herself as the victim being punished for some minor disagreement about lending money. The pressure kept building over the next week with more calls and even a few text messages from relatives asking us to reconsider. I finally snapped during a call from my cousin Arnold, who I actually liked and respected. He started with the same speech about family obligation, and I just could not take it anymore. I interrupted him and told him the whole story from the beginning. I described Dad showing up at Linda's house with my medical papers begging for help to save my leg. I told him about Linda throwing boiling water at Dad's feet in front of her book club friends. I explained about the burns and the nerve damage and Dad still limping 15 years later. I told him about the loan sharks and the interest rates and Dad working himself into the ground for 5 years to pay them back. Arnold went completely silent on the phone for almost a minute. Then he said he had no idea, and Linda told everyone that Dad was just holding a grudge because she could not lend him money one time. He said Linda made it sound like Dad asked to borrow money for something frivolous, and she said no, and now he was being petty about it. Arnold apologized for calling and said he would talk to other family members about what really happened. I could hear the anger in his voice when he hung up. Within 2 days, the family gossip network was buzzing with the real story. Cousins were calling each other, and aunts were texting back and forth sharing what they heard. Linda's pressure campaign fell apart completely as people realized she had lied to manipulate them. Several relatives called back to apologize for bothering us, and some even said they would never speak to Linda again after learning what she did. Linda showed up at my physical therapy clinic the following Tuesday during my lunch break. I was eating a sandwich in my car in the parking lot when I saw her Mercedes pull in. She got out and walked straight toward my car with this angry expression on her face. I rolled down my window and she immediately started yelling at me about turning the whole family against her. She said I was making her look like a monster and spreading lies about things that happened 15 years ago. I got out of my car and told her she made herself look like a monster by actually being one. Linda's face turned red and she raised her voice even louder, saying I had no right to tell family business to everyone. I reminded her that she was the one who called all those relatives to pressure us in the first place. She screamed that I was killing Robert by being stubborn and refusing to help when we had the power to save his life. Other people in the parking lot were staring at us now. One of my co-workers came outside to see what was happening. Linda pointed at me and yelled that I was letting an innocent man die out of spite. I told her she needed to leave my workplace immediately, or I would call security. She stood there shaking with rage for a few seconds, then turned and walked back to her car. She peeled out of the parking lot fast enough that her tires squealed on the pavement. That night around 9, my phone rang with a number I did not recognize. I almost did not answer, but something made me pick up. Robert's voice came through the phone sounding weak and tired in a way that made my chest hurt. He said he knew what Linda did to Dad 15 years ago, and he was not calling to make excuses for her or to beg for money. He just wanted me to know that he was scared of dying, and he wished his life did not depend on whether his wife was a good person 15 years ago. His voice cracked when he said it, and then he hung up before I could respond. I sat there holding my phone, staring at the screen, feeling like someone had punched me in the stomach. Robert was right that none of this was fair to him. He did not throw boiling water at my father. He did not treat tenants like garbage or spend 15 years being cruel to our family. He just married the wrong person, and now he was dying because his wife could not get money fast enough, and we would not help her. I felt tears running down my face thinking about Robert lying in that hospital bed scared and sick, while we all fought about things he had nothing to do with. I talked to Mom and Dad for hours that night about what was right versus what was fair. We sat at the kitchen table drinking tea while I told them about Robert's call. Dad admitted he had been having nightmares about the boiling water again since Linda showed up on our porch. He said he kept dreaming about standing in her living room with the hot water soaking through his pants and her book club friends watching him like he was something dirty. But he also said he could not stop thinking about Robert's face in those photos Linda showed us. He said Robert looked terrified, and that look reminded him of how scared he felt when the doctors said I might lose my leg. Mom cried quietly, while Dad talked about being torn between his anger at Linda and his guilt about Robert dying. She said she understood Dad's anger and she would support whatever he decided, but she also could not stop thinking about Robert being scared and alone. We went around in circles for hours trying to figure out what the right thing to do was when there was no clear answer that felt good. The next day, I started doing research into Linda's actual financial options. I called several banks asking about home equity loans and lines of credit as if I was inquiring for myself. I learned that with Linda's assets, she could definitely get funding, but it might take a few weeks, and the terms would not be great if she needed it rushed. I found Linda's financial advisor, Gary Morris, through her property management company's website. I called his office and told his secretary I was Linda's niece helping with family business. Gary called me back within an hour. I asked him directly about Linda's options for raising money quickly. Gary sighed and said Linda had several options, including loans against her properties or selling one property at a loss for quick cash. He said Linda was refusing those options because they would hurt her financially in the long term. She would have to accept high interest rates or sell a property for less than market value. Gary said Linda kept insisting there had to be a way to get the money without damaging her investment portfolio. I felt this cold clarity wash over me as I realized what was really happening. Linda could get the money if she was willing to sacrifice her own wealth and financial future. She just did not want to. She wanted us to save her from having to make the same kind of sacrifice Dad made for me 15 years ago. I called Linda and told her I needed to see her immediately. We met at a park near her house because I did not want to go to her home. I confronted her with everything Gary told me about her options. I said we knew she could get loans against her properties or sell one at a loss. Linda tried to deny it at first, but I kept pushing until she finally broke down. She admitted she did not want to destroy her financial future and lose everything she had built over the past 20 years. She said taking those loans would mean paying terrible interest for years, and she might lose some of her properties. She said selling a property quickly would mean accepting maybe 60% of what it was worth. Linda looked at me with tears running down her face and said she worked so hard for her success, and it was not fair that she had to give it all up. I felt my anger turn ice cold hearing her talk about fairness. I told her Dad destroyed his health and financial stability to save me when I was 15. I said he still has nerve damage in his feet, and he paid loan sharks for 5 years, and he never complained about it being unfair. I told Linda she needed to decide if she was willing to do the same thing for Robert that Dad did for me. She needed to decide if Robert's life was worth more than her investment portfolio. Linda sat there crying, but she did not say anything. I left her in the park and drove home feeling exhausted and empty. 3 days went by without a word from Linda. I kept checking my phone, expecting another angry call or a message blaming us for her problems, but there was nothing. Mom said maybe Linda finally accepted that we weren't going to save her and found another way. Dad didn't say much about it, but I could tell he was still thinking about Robert in that hospital bed looking scared and sick. On the 4th day, my phone rang while I was at work, and Linda's name showed up on the screen. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. Her voice sounded flat and tired when she told me she got the money for Robert's treatment. She said she took out loans against 3 of her rental properties at interest rates that would take her years to pay off. She might lose the properties eventually if she couldn't keep up with the payments, but at least Robert would get his treatment in time. I asked if she needed anything else, and there was this long pause where I could hear her breathing on the other end. She said no, she didn't need our help anymore, and then she hung up before I could say anything else. I stood there in the clinic hallway holding my phone and feeling this weird, empty sensation, like something important just ended, but I wasn't sure what it was. I figured that was the last I'd hear from Linda for a while, maybe forever. 2 days later, I came home from work and found her car parked in front of our house. My stomach dropped, thinking she was here to start another fight or make more demands. I walked up to the porch and found her sitting on the steps, looking down at her hands. She wasn't crying or yelling, just sitting there like she'd been waiting for hours. She looked up when I got close, and her face was completely different from every other time I'd seen her lately. All the anger and desperation were gone, and she just looked worn out and older somehow. She asked if Dad was home, and I told her he was inside. She nodded and stood up slowly like her body hurt. I went in first and told Dad that Linda was outside and wanted to talk to him. He got this guarded look on his face, but he went out to the porch anyway, and I followed because I needed to hear whatever was about to happen. Linda didn't waste time with small talk or excuses. She looked right at Dad and said she was sorry for throwing the boiling water at him 15 years ago. She said she was sorry for how she treated him all these years and for acting like his struggles were his own fault. She didn't add anything about how she was stressed that day, or how she didn't mean it, or how he should understand her position. She just apologized without any qualifiers for the first time in her entire life. Dad stood there for a long moment not saying anything, and I watched his face trying to figure out what he was thinking. Finally, he nodded once and told Linda he hoped Robert's treatment worked and that Robert would be okay. He didn't say he forgave her, and Linda didn't ask him to. She just thanked him quietly and walked back to her car and drove away. Over the next few months, I heard updates through various family members about how Robert's treatment was going. Apparently, the experimental therapy was actually working better than anyone expected, and Robert was responding well to it. Linda had to sell her Florida vacation house to help manage the debt from all those loans she took out. She also sold one of her rental properties at a loss because she needed the cash flow. But Robert was going to live, and that seemed to be all that mattered to her now. I ran into Linda at a family funeral 6 months after everything happened. It was for a distant cousin nobody really knew well, but our whole extended family showed up anyway. Linda looked different somehow, older and more tired, but also less sharp around the edges, like some of her hardness had worn away. She came up to me during the reception and thanked me quietly for confronting her about her options and for making her face what she'd done to Dad all those years ago. I didn't really know what to say to that, so I just nodded and told her I was glad Robert was doing better. She smiled a little and said she was too, and then she moved on to talk to other relatives. Dad and Linda aren't close now, and they probably never will be again. They're polite at family events, and they ask about each other's health, but there's no real warmth there, and that's okay, because some things can't be fixed with apologies, no matter how sincere they are. But I noticed Dad seems lighter somehow, like he's carrying less weight around with him. I think standing his ground when Linda came begging, and then watching her have to sacrifice her own wealth and comfort to save Robert, gave him something back that the burns and the years of debt took away from him. It wasn't about making Linda suffer, or getting revenge on her for what she did. It was about making her finally understand what she'd done, and forcing her to be the person she should have been all along, even if it came 15 years too late. Sometimes the best revenge isn't making someone else hurt. It's making them finally see themselves clearly and watching them choose to do the right thing, even when it costs them everything they thought mattered.